Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Coffee with Envision. I'm Daniel Wolkoff, President and CEO of Envision Networks, and I have a few quick announcements before we start today's presentation of 10 ways to get the most out of your guest. We encourage you to ask questions during the presentation. Please send your questions to daveh@envisionnetworks.com. That's D-A-V-E, the letter H, @envisionnetworks, which is plural.com. We'll answer as many as we can at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll send you the link to the presentation later today. Feel free to use the recorded version for future playback, to share with your fellow air talent and others at the station. And with that said, I'm pleased to introduce you to today's host, Michael Lichtstein, VP of Programming at Envision Networks. Michael has been with Envision since 2006 and has been the Vice President since 2009. He oversees the company's lineup of programs and features and is the creator and producer of Guest Services, which provides a unique lineup of pop culture guests and celebrities for morning shows to choose for both live and recorded interviews each day. Michael's experience in programming extends to Carson Daly's syndicated radio show, MTV and VH1. He also worked at WFAS-FM in New York and as a writer of American Top 40 with Shadoe Stevens. So with no further ado, let's turn it over. Michael, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you, Dano, and welcome to those listening wherever you may be listening from. What we want to do today is help you get the most out of your interviews. Guests are an integral part of most morning shows, and whether you're speaking with a Hollywood actress or an athlete or someone who made headlines in the local paper, there are effective ways to get the most out of your guests. Likewise, there are interview pitfalls that you want to avoid at all costs. We've all done them, and we may not even be aware that we're doing them, but they cause instant tune-out, and that's something none of us want. So we'll give you a few of those as well, and at the end, we'll answer a few questions. I'll also have two secret weapons for you, the first of which we'll get to in just a little bit here. Stating the obvious, there are many different types of interviews. There are the hard-hitting interviews, like the ones you might hear on 60 Minutes. You have the old Barbara Walters technique where her end game is to make her guests cry. Nothing wrong with that, by the way, it makes for good TV. However, most of us here today are probably on-air talent at a radio station and most likely part of a morning show. So those are the types of interviews that we're going to focus on today. And we begin with number one, probably the single most important thing you can do: prepare, prepare, prepare. Just as I'm sure you do with the rest of your show, you want to prepare for your interview. We can all hear it. The quality of an interview changes dramatically based on whether or not you've prepared and done your research. Firstly, have as good an understanding as possible about what the guest is coming on to promote. If it's a book, get an advance copy and read it if possible. If it's a TV movie, ask for a screener. If it's an album, ask for a downloadable link. You don't need to sit back and have the guest go on and on about the project they've come on to promote. Have fun questions ready. Maybe your guest rewrote half the script even though they weren't the screenwriter, or maybe they had to shoot a love scene for the first time. Control the interview by using talking points that will trigger the interest of your listeners. The more research you do, the better off you'll be and the easier the interview will be for you. That brings me to secret weapon number one: read. Reading makes you more well-rounded, and I promise you that novel you read 20 years ago is going to come in handy in one of your upcoming interviews. Our next tip at number two: be engaging, and by extension, be passionate and be relatable. Number one and number two here are closely entwined. Your goal is to engage your guest, and in doing so, you'll engage your audience. So be into it. Find something about your guest that gets you super interested, and use that as a launch pad for the rest of the interview. If you have a celebrity author on, do not say this: so, you have a new book out, tell us about it. That is instant tune-out. No one cares, and it shows a lack of preparation. Be prepared and be impassioned. Pick out a subject or a passage that you think will be of particular interest to your listeners and start the interview there. Maybe you start off by saying, hey, I was reading through your new book, and I couldn't believe that as a playmate, you had to share a bedroom with Hugh Hefner's sons? That's just crazy. How did that come to be? And relate to them. You could say, hey, you and I have something in common. We both asked our girlfriends to marry us 3 times before they finally said yes. By relating to your guest, you are engaging your guest, which translates into a compelling interview. Here now is an example of being well prepared and being passionate. This comes at the very top of the interview. Take a listen.
I'm telling you, this book, because now I'm almost all the way done with it, how many bullets have been fired at you? How many bombs have gone off near you? How many fights have you been in? How many times have you almost been killed by drug lords? I mean, it's a nonstop, like, you're not kidding when you say, hey, man, I don't want to be the guy they say that used to be Geraldo Rivera. Like, you want to get smoked doing what you love.
I just got asked by Hannity to go find that caravan of undocumented immigrants making their way to our southern border. So I may be taking a detour on my promotional tour for the book.
That's our good friend Johnny Dare from KQRC in Kansas City with Geraldo Rivera. You could hear how passionate he was, and he gets right to it. You don't ever want to let up on being engaging and compelling. Up next at number 3, set up your guest to your listeners. First of all, don't stop down because your guest is coming on. Keep the engaging conversation flowing. You don't want this huge chasm between the compelling conversation your morning show just had on the air and the start of your guest interview. Try as best you can to flow right into it. Now, a good thing to do is to talk about your guest or talk briefly about their project or what happened to them before you actually bring them on. This is especially important with topical guests or unknown guests you're having on because they made headlines in some way. And do your setup in the present tense. Keep it active. So you might say something like, okay, so there's this guy in Long Island and he's in the water with his wife. And suddenly they see a shark fin in the water. And at first they think it's a kid playing around. Well, it turns out this is really a 24-foot great white shark, and it chomps on this guy not once, but twice. Well, he somehow gets out of the water alive, and since it's Shark Week, we thought we'd have him on. Hi, Jimmy, thanks for being here. So tell us, where did the shark get you? That's one example of setting up your guest. Here now is another example.
On the hotline right now, Bailey Gibson is there, the 23-year-old virgin who is, she's auctioning off her virginity in October. It will all go down at the Moonlight Bunny Ranch.
It's a pretty amazing idea. Now, it's not new. We've seen this before. But because some men desire it so much, they will pay that much money for a virgin.
We heard the setup, and now we're hooked, right? Now I want to hear what this woman has to say. That's, again, Johnny Dare, KQRC in Kansas City. A good setup will hook the listener right away. Our next tip at number 4, don't gush. Please don't gush. Let your guests know you're happy to have them on with you. However, don't overdo it. They are on the same level as you. If you put them on too high a pedestal, it's going to affect their answers. I mean, no one wants to fall off a pedestal. So as a result, they might not show their vulnerable side or something that makes them look uncool, which could have been a funny moment for your audience. Furthermore, if you're just telling them how great they are, how is that keeping your audience entertained? Certainly acknowledge their accomplishments, but then move on. You don't want to get them to let their guard down, and you do that by making them you want to let them let their guard down, and you do that by making them a regular person. Here now is an example of what not to do.
First of all, I'm just going to start asking you questions. I am so starstruck. I'm like the hugest fan ever. I am such a huge fan.
That's this, okay? So why are you a huge fan?
I love your music. I love everything about it.
Anything in particular?
Standing Outside the Fire was like my anthem when I turned 30 and I changed careers. I would listen to it all the time and I felt like you were with me, helping me do it. So
This is great.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. Okay, now I'm calmed down a little bit.
Right.
That's an actual entertainment reporter, but what did I learn there that's of any interest to me? Not much. So don't gush too much. Up next at number 5, make use of the mirroring technique. With a mirroring technique, you repeat back to the guest something they said in order to go deeper into a story. And in doing so, you can get impactful results. So if your guest is a quarterback and he's saying, it was my first trip to the Super Bowl and the coach took me out with 2 minutes left to play, and the next season I shattered my kneecap in training camp and I was never the same since, maybe you go back and say, wow, so the coach took you out of the Super Bowl with 2 minutes to play. And your guest probably says, yeah, it was just awful. Here's why. Now you're getting a deeper story that you might otherwise not have gotten from him. So while your guest is telling the story, listen for moments that sound like they're stories unto themselves. And the best stories are always ones that play on the guest's emotions. That makes for great radio. Our next tip at number 6, include the listeners. Invite the listeners to participate with your guest in some way. Anything you do that's interactive is going to engage your audience, and contests are a great example of that. Another good way for the listeners to participate when you have a guest on is leaving some time for them to ask their own questions. And you'll want to pre-screen the callers to make sure they're asking a good question which other listeners would be interested in, or at least to ensure that they're doing something that makes for good radio. Maybe the caller is sharing a dream they had about the guest, or maybe they're quizzing the guest with dialogue from one of their early films. You can't go wrong with listener involvement as long as you are controlling who gets on the air. Another good way to engage your listeners is through social media before and after your interview. And since millennials are the best at making use of social media, I'm going to turn this one over to our senior talent booker and producer, who just happens to be a millennial. This is Devin Southard.
Thanks, Michael. So I've had some producers reach out to me and tell me they're a bit intimidated by social media. And while I understand this, I'm here to let you all know all social media is a tool to further expand your show within and beyond your market. Many guests, especially bigger names, are extremely active on social media and are always looking for new users to engage with. Now, since your show already has a built-in audience, you're someone they'll definitely want to interact with. So a great way to begin a rapport with a guest before the interview is to start promoting them on Twitter or Instagram. 9 times out of 10, whenever we've run a tour and someone does this, that guest will definitely engage with you and start the conversation. Now, this is a great tool for you because you're letting your listeners know what's happening, but also that guest is letting their fans know that they need to tune into your show right before it's happening. And an easy way for you to engage with your fans and your other listeners is to try and get questions from them using social media. Go on Twitter beforehand and say, hey guys, we're going to be talking to Terry Crews. What's something you've always wanted to learn about him? If you read a couple of those questions on air, maybe 1 or 2, it's an easy way to make listeners feel like they're a part of the show and part of the conversation. Now, once you've finished your interview, a great way to keep fans online engaged is to cut down the best moments from the interview and post those clips on your social media feed. It's an easy way to keep traffic coming and keep the conversation going with the guests. Be sure to tag them in it so that they can easily respond to you and your listeners as well. And that's a great way to keep using social media to keep your show going.
Perfect, Devin. Thank you so much. With that, we'll move on to number 7, which is make it local. Do your best to tie the guest into the community. And this is a great way to connect with your guest, with the listeners. Research your guest and any possible connections to your city or market. Did your guest go to school there? Did they get their first big break there? Did they recently perform a show there? During your interview, you can ask, what do they remember about that night? Did your guest and their band go out to eat after the show? If so, the listener may very well know the places you end up talking about. Maybe they went there the other night. So you and the guest are sharing a common experience with the listener. Here now is an example of making it local.
You were here a couple of years ago for a job fair that our company did, which was amazing when you were here. What more beyond that history do you have with Buffalo, if any?
Well, the Wild Wings joint, that was a lot of fun, where they originated the hot wings.
Oh, the Anchor Bar, yeah.
Anchor Bar, that's what it was. I love the Anchor Bar.
That's from WGRF in Buffalo. They're always great about asking guests if they have any ties to Buffalo, and most of them actually do. Now here comes secret weapon number 2, food. Most people love to talk about and hear about food and eating. Now, I have no stats to support this, but I have noticed that people love to talk about great food they ate, and people perk up when they hear about something delicious that someone else ate. So try it with your guests and with your morning crew. On a Monday, ask them about the best thing they ate over the weekend. I promise it will be a fun conversation. Food brings people together. Up next at number 8, integrate. Make your guest a part of your show's regular flow. This is especially important at the beginning of the interview. We talked earlier about setting up your guest. One great thing to do is simply to insert them into the conversation your morning show is already having. So taking a cue from earlier, you might start off by saying, hey, Katie, we're talking about the best thing we ate this past weekend. What about you? Obviously, you'll want to make sure ahead of time that your guest has a good story. That's essential, which goes back to being prepared. Perhaps in the researching of your guests, you'll come up with a great story that can spark a topic starter for your show. So, for instance, let's say if you read that comedian Artie Lang, for example, fell asleep in public, naked, which isn't much of a stretch. Maybe earlier in the hour before Artie comes on, your crew talks about the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to them in public. You can take calls from listeners and then bring Artie on and ask him. What else can you do to integrate your guests into what your show does? play a quick and appropriate game with them towards the end of the interview. Here now is an example of that.
What we usually do with the guests before we let them go, to keep track of everyone and give everyone a ranking, because that's what we do here, we play a game for our dog board. What we need you to do is name as many dog breeds as you can in about 10 seconds. Do you think you could do that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, give me 1 second.
The lead right now is 9.
Yeah, the lead is 9. So if you can beat 9, if you can get 10, you'll be the winner. All right, You ready?
Yes.
3, 2, 1, go.
Poodle, German Shepherd, Chihuahua, Rottweiler, Greyhound, Schnoodle.
10. There you go. You're done.
Schnoodle?
You got 6. I don't know if Schnoodle is a dog.
Is that a schnauzer and a poodle?
Sounds like a dessert.
It is, yeah.
Still.
Of course there's such a thing as a schnoodle. I have one. No, I don't. But there you go. A quick game is always a great way to go. Up next at number 9, use segments. Chop it up. If you're in a PPM market, and even if you're in a diary market, you want to keep things short and sweet because you want to get back into the music, right? So if you've been given a 10-minute window with a guest, pre-record your interview and plan out 2 to 3 minute segments and spread them out. Obviously, if you have a truly compelling conversation going on, you can let it play out a bit. That's something that you as the talent are going to be able to feel. But more often than not, the guest isn't going to be so great that you want to speak with them for 8 to 10 minutes straight. Your audience will have had enough and your numbers could dip. A great technique that is vastly underused is the tease and payoff. Watch your entertainment shows on TV. They're great at it. So you might go into a stop set saying, "We're speaking with Luke Moore. A bank glitch gave him unlimited credit, so he blew over $2 million that wasn't his. So the big question is, what happened to him when the bank found out?" You're not going to want to miss this. The answer is coming up. That's an example. So try the tease and payoff technique. And on to our final tip at number 10, watch the whys. Now, I'm not saying they're necessarily bad, but you want to be careful with why questions. Yes, they can be very probing questions, which could lead to some insightful answers. Why questions do have a tendency to challenge your guests. Now, again, I'm not saying there aren't certain instances where you want to challenge your guest, but we're focusing these discussions on morning radio, and one thing you don't want to do is put them on the defensive. Here's an example of what I mean. So why did you decide to write this book now as opposed to 3 years ago after the explosion happened? Right there, your guest has to defend him or herself, and the quality of your conversation will most likely take a dip. So just be careful and thoughtful when it comes to your why questions. So there you have it, 10 ways to get the most out of your guest. Hopefully you've got something out of it. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dano.
Terrific. Thanks, Michael, and thanks to Devin as well. We just have enough time to take a few questions, so let me throw these at you really quick. The first is from Frogman. He says, "I like guests, but my program director says, quote, ratings go down when we have guests on the air, end quote. How should I respond to my PD?"
We hear this from time to time. I've tried to find stats to combat that statement. However, I really don't need any stats for this. Your entire show is about staying engaging and staying connected to the listener. And as we talked about, the key is the beginning of the interview. So think about it. Is there really a big difference between asking a compelling question to a guest and asking one to a member of your morning show? I mean, sure, the subject matter may differ, but it's really not all that different. For every host or producer who tells me they've been told interviews bring their numbers down, I've spoken to a host or producer who says, no way, our numbers are just fine when they speak with guests. Again, you want to start your interview in strong fashion, know exactly where you want to stay. Start right in and hook the listener with a compelling setup and first question, and then keep the great questions coming. And again, keep your segment short and sweet. Make the listener want to hear more.
Excellent point. Jeff in Columbus writes, what should I do when a big name guest is a no-show after promoting him or her all morning long?
Yeah, unfortunately, this happens from time to time. I saw Carson Daly do something once on TRL, and it was really funny. I think he was supposed to speak with Mark Wahlberg, and Mark canceled last minute. So the producers scrambled, and they found another guy named Mark Wahlberg. And Carson asked him the same questions he was going to ask the real Mark. And Carson told him, you've got to answer each question. It was really funny. You too could scramble during a stop set, or when it comes to a guest who has a reputation for being late or canceling last minute, be prepared. Have someone on standby who shares the same name as your guest. I mean, some instances, yes, might be harder than others. Maybe you can find someone with just the same first name. That also works, but maybe try that out.
If not, Michael and Devin have agreed to be on standby. You can call. They'll role play anyone you want to. All right, last question. This is from Sherry in Portland. What can my show do when an interview falls flat and it is clearly boring for the listener?
Ugh, that is the worst, isn't it? Interviews that are going nowhere slowly. A few things you can do. Number one, pick up the pace. Give the interview a jolt of energy by going quicker and asking shorter questions. When are you going to do a comedy? Or how much weight did you gain for this role? Keep things moving. You could play a game with them or quiz them about their own work. Something else you can do is make a reference to something personal about yourself that is funny or embarrassing. It's a great way to lighten the mood. You might say, believe it or not, I once did half an interview with Corey Haim thinking it was Corey Feldman. If the guest isn't being captivating, just let your guard down and perhaps they will too.
All right, Michael, any final thoughts before we let everyone go?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for spending your coffee break with us. I also want to thank you, Dano, for allowing me to share my knowledge on this subject matter. I want to thank Devin for her great insight. And I want to thank our top-notch support staff, our marketing director, Dave Hintz, who put together the fantastic PowerPoint you've been looking at and mapping out today's webinar, and our operations director, Matt Wardlaw, who is basically running the entire show today. So thank you all.
And thank you to Michael Lichtstein, and thanks for everyone joining us today. I hope all or some of these 10 tips helps you get the most from your guest and gives you a edge to beat the competition in the marketplace. Michael would be happy to answer any additional questions you might have. Please contact him at the number or email address that you just saw on your screen. As a bonus for attending today's webinar, you can get a free 2-week trial of guest services, which will send you an email highlighting upcoming guests and their availability for a specific date. And all you simply have to do is respond if you want to book them on your show. Also, please watch your inbox for a survey about today's webinar. Your responses help us develop future topics that interest you. And look for an invitation to our next Coffee with Envision, which will cover listener music research in the age of digital. And that will happen on November 8th. Again, thanks for participating and attending today. Everyone have a terrific afternoon. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.